Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to Ceipal University, Ceipal Connect. We have a great presentation today on creating a brand clients will do business with. Unfortunately, our partner, Scott Montminy from Mind Media cannot be with us today, so you're stuck with me. We're going to jump into the presentation. We have a lot of material to cover, but before we do so, I just want to give a couple housekeeping items. First, there will be a 5-minute Q&A session following this presentation. Please enter all of your questions in the question tab, and we'll do our best to address each one. The second thing is that we are on a very strict schedule today. So as you see, we're starting promptly at 9:30, and we will end promptly at 10 o'clock so everyone can get to their other sessions. So if we don't get to your question, or if you have another thing that you want addressed, just email contact@ceipal.com and we'll address your questions there. For now, I'm just going to check really quickly to make sure that you can all see and hear me. Okay, I think we're good. If you can't see or hear me, just drop something in the chat and then we'll be good to go. Okay, great. But for now, I'm going to play our presentation and we'll begin. Okay. So the first thing when we talk about branding today is that we have to talk about our current climate. So COVID-19 has really thrown a wrench in not only the staffing industry, but our global economy and all industries worldwide. The definition of the workplace changed overnight. All of a sudden, we're on a remote model, we're doing virtual collaborations. Ceipal Connect, our all virtual conference, is a testament to this. Because we've gone to this remote model, the needs of the workplace have also changed. So the top priorities of candidates and employees have shifted. Questions like, will you give me the resources I need to do the work? Will you be in constant contact with me as I go through and I'm hired for a different employer or consultant? These are questions that candidates increasingly need answered. Those companies and staffing firms that did not have the infrastructure in place to equip their employees for a remote model of work are suffering heavily because of COVID-19. Another really important thing for companies now to consider is the importance of health and flexibility. For years now, we've seen a shift in the workforce that companies increasingly have to address things like health concerns, flexibility, making sure that your environment is diverse, friendly to race, friendly to gender, etc. Stability and security are key. We need to address people's concerns. To create a good brand, you need to address people's concerns, and you need to do so clearly and concisely. It's no longer just about money, and it can't be anymore. Having a company that is just about money is a good way to not get employees. People want to know that your brand is environmentally friendly, that it's taking into account the issues of the current climate, and that it's doing so in an intentional and sustainable way. So as you can see on our right-hand chart here, 66% of companies are now very concerned about the COVID-19 outbreak, which is an increase from March. So as we address this current climate, we want to make sure that your brand is following the marketplace trends. That's the best way to set yourself apart. Not to be tone deaf to our current moment, and to follow the market trends consistently and communicate the fact that you're following those trends to your employees. So examine your niche. If you serve an industry that's at a standstill, your brand needs to pivot. Ford in the US is a really good example of this. So Ford obviously makes cars, but in the wake of COVID-19, they transitioned all of their manufacturing to make masks and other healthcare materials that would then help the people, healthcare workers, people who are affected by the crisis. And that's a huge branding opportunity for Ford. Now they can appeal to the American market. They can say that they're helping COVID-19, and they establish themselves as a market voice that's reliable and really takes into account the current climate, their employees, and the safety of the consumers that they serve. If your client
hear me?
Scott,
Look at, I'm busting into the session. How about that?
Beautiful. Oh, I'm so glad. So everyone, this is Scott Montminy. We just had some technical issues, but he is now with us to join. Scott, this is his presentation. So Scott is an expert on branding. He's a partner at Mind Media. He has over 20 years experience in marketing. He's run his own networks. He is a great partner and a great friend, and we are so happy to welcome him to begin the presentation. So Scott, take it away.
Well, first of all, thanks a lot, Sheila, for covering me through my technical difficulties. But for some reason, once the session was live, I was able to break right in. See, I guess I just couldn't join as early as I wanted to. I was just chomping at the bit there.
Too excited.
And you'll remember what Sheila was saying, because I was following it as an attendee. I have two computers running here, and all the business models have changed. You should change as you may need your business model. There was a recent report, globally, for example, out of Australia and New Zealand, that 1 in 3 recruiters have lost their jobs since the pandemic started. That's pretty alarming statistics, and that carnage not only has hit recruitment agencies, but even internal recruiters and talent acquisition professionals are getting axed at what seems to be, at least anecdotally, an alarming rate. In addition to the hard data we're getting from that corner of the world in particular, it seems to reflect at least some global trends. The good news is this: you might have to shift your focus or move your book of business. That may not sound like good news, but I can tell you that folks at other Ceipal webinars that Sheila and I have both sat in on, or I've listened, that she's coordinated on, have told us that the recs are still out there if you look in the right places, and you can't stop recruiting and just wait for the floodgates to open to begin recruiting again when that's over. Because if you do that, you're going to miss that golden opportunity that's on the horizon and lose to agencies that keep filling that talent pipeline through the pandemic. So there is a light at the end of the tunnel. There always is. It's why it's important to update your brand, because you want to reflect these current realities. And what do I mean by this? There are still companies that are hiring. So if your brand can be flexible and resilient, you might not only survive the pandemic, but ultimately you will thrive when it's behind us. The world's changed. It's not going back anytime soon, at least we don't think, right? We all suspect that it's going to take some time, but none of us know for sure what's next and how much time. So it might be a year, it might be the rest of our lives. Let's hope it's sooner than that, but we have to accept that we're living in a constant state of flux and flexibility right now. And if your brand doesn't reflect that, you might find that you're in a bit of trouble with clients, because they're looking to shift too. I'll give you an example that's close to home for me, which might not relate to staffing industry, but my wife owns a dance competition event that requires big gatherings, people getting close together to one another in small spaces. They dance, they compete, and they celebrate dance together. It was canceled in April. Obviously, with everything happening in COVID, you couldn't run through that. She tried to shift immediately, and we worked together on virtual events, but feedback from virtually every studio, and we're talking, dozens of studios, was, we want a live event. So we had our work cut out for us. We had to figure out how to rebrand. How do we make people feel safe and actually make them safe while promoting the brand of Diamond Dance Awards? So with a staff of 30 people, not only are we talking to attendees, we're also talking to people on our own staff, because you have to determine who's on board, who feels safe, what can you do to make them feel safe. So branding really encompasses not just your external audiences, because we typically think about what it means to customers and clients. It also relates to what people right here at home think too. So Sheila, if we could go to slide 4. Here in the States, we're dealing with a reckoning of sorts of, in the United States, of systemic racism and implicit bias. It just never seems to go away, despite some efforts due to some recent police brutality and the killing of an African-American named George Floyd that you may have read about in headlines. You may have heard about it. I know it's spread worldwide to some extent, but if we can just step back from the tragic nature of all of that, we might come to realize it's more than morally imperative to rectify the lack of diversity and inclusivity where we find it, which certainly is morally imperative, but it's also imperative from a business perspective. So you might say it's an organization's fiduciary responsibility as well. If we can get into that slide, and we're right there. So how do you convey to your customers that you're meeting that critical need of inclusivity and diversity? Well, when telling your brand story, you have to demonstrate the value of diversity first off. That's why we have some stats in there, including the fact that organizations are 45% more likely to improve their market share if they have a diverse workforce. Diversity encompasses more than race and gender. We'll get into that. But also, KPMG hired 44% more females thanks to using an AI assessment tool. So there is another messaging point that might be incorporated into your brand if you do have such advantages in the marketplace. You should tout your organization's processes and technologies that ensure diverse and inclusive outcomes when it comes to hiring. But it's intersectional. So remember, it's not just gender and race. Diversity, I spent a lot of time on branding and marketing and public relations with a defense technology company you may have heard of called Raytheon. And there was constant discussion around diversity, but it wasn't just about, hiring minorities and underrepresented from underrepresented communities. I mean, they went everywhere to recruit in order to do that. But when they talked about diversity, Tom Kennedy, the CEO, would always talk about diversity of thought. And if you don't have a diverse stream of thought coming in around your roundtables, you're not going to get where you need to be, at least in terms from a competitive standpoint. So just remember, when we talk diversity, it goes beyond the things that we typically think about. Make sure that you demonstrate all those value levels within your own company so that your clients come to understand you. And I think this is a topic that we'll be coming back to, but you have to be authentic. You can't scream diversity and inclusivity from the rooftops if you don't reflect that in your workforce, your own workforce. How can you tell a company that you want to do recruiting for that we're going to find you a diverse workforce when you can't even find one for yourself? So that comes down to authenticity and building your brand. I think that especially today, that is probably the number one thing that you can do to help your brand right now is, once you put that stake in the ground, be authentic to it and be true to it. You don't have to be extreme in what your position is with that brand, but whatever your position is, and it can be a conservative position or it can be a progressive position, depending on how you feel. But diversity and inclusivity should go beyond any of those politics anyway. The last stat that I put there was that diverse organizations are 35% more likely to financially outperform their industry average than organizations that are less diverse. So if the moral imperative isn't enough for you, then the financial incentive is there for you as well. So it really is important. And in all this is to say that your brand is, why do I tell you that? Well, if we go to slide 5, it's really simple. Your brand is not in a vacuum anymore. I feel this is sort of, it really went without saying even in 2019 that you're no longer working in a vacuum because of social media, because of digital connections and networks. That silo that, many of us who are, 10 years ago, I think there was more of a silo where you could live, but now you're out in the wild. So you don't have a choice but to be out there facing the public. So there was a global web index survey recently. It found that most brands are discovered via promotions on social media, paid campaigns in particular. But if you look at that chart on the right, you'll see that a very close second involved owned social media. So what do I mean by paid versus owned? Well, I'm a public relations practitioner. So we talk about owned media when we do content campaigns, when we, blog on our websites, our client websites, whatever those are your owned channels. Then, there are paid campaigns, of course, where you can pay for advertising. And then there are earned campaigns. So actually, I think of a real social media program where your key stakeholders are interacting with you. And not only that, but they're interacting with key influencers and with your customers. That is a really robust earned campaign. So what do I mean by earned. You're really earning it. You're out there. Yes, it's an owned channel, but it gets you into those streams of influencers where you're garnering earned media. Now, if you're going to reach your audience through those means, guess what it requires? Well, we've talked about it before, but authenticity. So technology, social media, digital connections, they've put you out there. And as far as candidates go, by the way, there's a growing demand for meaningful work, particularly among the young. So that's also a game changer in terms of developing your brand as you think about how you want to be presented in the world, because now everybody is standing on this tall platform. And you also have to think about how your clients have changed things, because their branding's tied directly to their own workforce too. So who they hire is going to reflect who they are. So when you tell them who you're going to hire, it better reflect who you are, because they're going to want to see that and they're going to want to relate. And that's how you're going to mesh, and that's how you're going to make their brand connect with you. And I keep pushing it, but if we go to the next slide, you see that I say, authenticity is the mother of all branding. I don't know, that might be maybe a little dramatic, but it really is true. I like hammering on this theme because by extension, transparency for your brand is important too. But if we take a look, we know how to be authentic in our day-to-day lives, but how do we reflect that in what we do in the recruitment industry or any other sector for that matter? Modern people, I feel, are very cynical. We've seen it all. 2020, I mean, have we not seen it all? I mean, I think we have. At this point, we've seen everything from politics to business. We're a cynical people, aren't we? A lot of us anyway. I know I tend to be. I try to be an optimist, but at times I slip into that cynicism of, from the apparent insincerity of like every corporate master to the hypocrisy of some of our world leaders. And I'm not making a political statement there. I'm just saying that we all have our own feelings and opinions, and we get skeptical of people in the age of 2020. So Karen Parkin at Adidas, the reason I included a picture of her to the right, you may have heard this. She was their HR chief for a long time, I think dating back to the late 90s. So she was there for over 20 years. And she made the mistake, very bad mistake, of attending a meeting in Boston, Massachusetts, which is the area where I'm based, for I think Converse is one of their brands. And they were at a round table with all of her other chiefs, and they were talking about a problem. People felt that there was racism within the company, and she said, well, that's just background noise. So she was very dismissive of it. Meanwhile, this is a company that needs to market to people of every ethnic background, as you can imagine. She had to step down because of those comments. Employees didn't like it, and they could point to the fact that there were only, for example, I believe it was 5%. Of 5% of the workforce, I think, came from a minority background or something like that. So Adidas after she stepped down, they put out a statement on Instagram. They had to confront it and say the success of Adidas would be nothing without Black athletes, Black artists. I mean, you can imagine. I mean, it's very much a brand that is in every community, Black employees and Black consumers, period. It's time to own up to our silence. Black Lives Matter. So like sitting back, it's no longer an option, because these things get out beyond your walls so quickly in the digital age and in the age of social media. Maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago, that could have been swept under the rug. But today, no such luck. Every brand has to be out there. Every brand is exposed. You're already out there. You are exposed. So how do you be authentic? Well, cliches don't work. They didn't really work in 2019. I know that, but they're certainly not going to fly today. Your taglines, your boilerplates, they really have to be genuine, and they have to matter. Differentiators, be different. Don't just tell me that, yes, we are first, best, and only. That's a common mistake of brands, just stating it. Show us. Tell us why. You need real proof points, and you need those proof points to be a little bit different. You can't just state, we use artificial intelligence. You have to say how you're using it, because everybody's using it now. So you have to say, what does that mean to your brand if you're using, for example, an AI-enabled ATS. Authenticity, it comes from within, so you really have to practice what you preach. People get wise to it very quickly these days if you're not authentic. I'm going to have to move ahead to slide 7. So all that said, your brand is still just a story. It's your story, though. So how do you develop it, and how do you make it compelling? Now, let's take a look at the slide. So the narrative of your brand has to encompass the facts and feeling that your brand embodies. So of course you have your proof points. You want a nice format. You want to frame it well. You want a data-driven approach. I feel emotions are really important when it comes to your brand. You want to say you're innovative. Everyone's saying it. You have to tell, why are you innovative? What is it that you're doing? You have to have real customer stories that reinforce that. We'll get back to this, but why does your brand exist? Consistency. You have to tell it across every platform. The story has to be told everywhere. Your brand's personality has to be consistent with the values of your organization. So that's that internal reflection of it, but also of your customers. So you need to align with them. You don't want to work with customers that don't align with your values. That's not good for your brand. It's not good for you. The best business is going to align well. You're going to jibe well with those customers. And that's why Adidas ran into such problems. They weren't aligning. They weren't gelling. And they figured that out. And when their HR chief stepped down, they began taking corrective measures. Be sure to tie your brand story to the needs and emotions of your customers, as well as the competitive environment. So earlier we talked about, COVID-19 has changed everything. I mean, you're not in a vacuum, but also that doesn't just mean that you're out there and people see who you are. It also means that there's a whole brave new world out there. So, and the next slide, how do we tell your brand's story? This chart was provided by OneSpot, and I could provide after all the sources for some of these because I was appreciative to find them that speak to my proof points. But I consider myself a storyteller first. I know I joined a few minutes late, so I wasn't able to tell you background about myself, but I worked in television news. I worked in radio news. I've been a reporter. I've been an anchor, and it's been this sort of dual trajectory of my career that involved news. And news is storytelling. And for an example, my last television assignment, which was 5 years ago, as a traffic reporter, I would do a lot of things to get attention, but I also had to have the content to back it up. So once you get the intention, be concise, be clear, use quality content, use images are key, really key. RuPaul, who's a famous model in the US who does a runway show, he says, you like money? Wear a suit. Okay, I like money. I think we all like it to some extent. I'm not wearing a suit, granted, but I'm working from home today, so I don't feel it's necessary. But he says it's not because you have to be fancy. It's really because that suit tells a narrative before you even talk, before you walk in the room. Your suit already tells a story about you. So it doesn't have to be a suit. That was his example. But your brand is the same way. Images are so important. Everyone is in the image business now. We used to say in public relations, we're in the image business. I feel that now everyone is, because again, we're all exposed. Next slide. Speaking of PR, it's not just putting out a press release. We used to talk about PR in a much different way, but in the digital age, that doesn't work anymore. You could be a small boutique PR agency that's helping a recruitment firm. Or you could be helping a mid-sized enterprise B2B company on a budget as a consultant, but it doesn't mean whatever your individual case is with your firm or agency or company through the recruitment world in the staffing industry, it doesn't mean you can't include PR considerations into whatever program you do have in terms of marketing and communications. In fact, you need to have a plan for it, whether or not you have an agency of record. You can do this internally too. Every company has a public to deal with, and dealing with the public always requires a level of relationship building. So It helps you reinforce your brand. It cuts through industry jargon. It tells a story that some of the folks in the media are going to relate to. It moves beyond your company walls with owned and earned channels, as we talked about earlier, and it can really be the backbone of a good content marketing program, which I think is so crucial today.
Hey,
Next
Scott,
slide. Yep.
this is great. I just want to give you a 5-minute heads up.
Fair enough.
Do we want to pause for Q&A, or should we push through and finish the presentation? I see we have 2 questions here. So what do you think is going to be best?
I think we can fly through the last couple of slides.
Great.
If that's
Let's do it. Yeah, perfect.
So rather than bore you with some of my stories about Purple Feather and some of the campaigns they've done to prove this, I'm just going to leave the proof points here that emotion drives human behavior. It has to be part of your brand. It's bigger than logic when it comes to your brand's ROI. So you need an emotional connection that separates you from your competitors, and it will create brand loyalty over time. And this has been scientifically proven. If we go to the next slide, who are you telling your story to? It's important to consider. Clients and customers are critical. They're not your only audience. As I said, you have to tell that story to your employees too, because your employees are also an important audience that your brand needs to speak to. A practical consideration. The next slide, where are you telling your story? On premises, print, collateral, signage, packaging, websites, content publishing, marketing, public relations campaigns, your sales, and your customer services. And then finally, I just want to get to the last and most important question that you should ask about your brand when you're determining who you are is why. Why do you do what you do? You have to discover the purpose behind what you're doing, who you are, why do you exist, what differentiates you, what problem are you solving. Studies show that 50% of consumers make purchasing decisions based on a company's brand values and the impact of that brand. So it's really an important thing to understand. And with that, I do want to open it up to questions, if I may.
Great. Scott, thank you so much. This was just a great presentation. I'm so happy you were able to join.